Sí se puede, sí se puede, no hay imposibles. Sí se puede, sí se puede. Juntos somos más, juntos somos fuertes, juntos lo podemos lograr, lograr. No hay imposible, sí se puede lograr, lograr. No hay imposible, juntos somos más, juntos somos fuertes, juntos lo podemos lograr, lograr.
So my name is Maya Ibars. I am an immigration lawyer, and I'm currently working with Otro Lado, which is a binational organization that does work to help immigrants in Mexico and in the United States. And I work with the Border Rights Project, which is based out of Tijuana.
I imagine there's several terms that we'll be exploring throughout this conversation that some folks might not be entirely familiar with. So I'm wondering if there's a few that you want to sort of lay out, just to, set the tone and give us an idea of what we're going to be exploring today.
There's a lot of acronyms in immigration law, both the government entities and the programs that they implement. I would say that the most typical or most frequent acronym that I'm going to be using today is MPP, which stands for Migrant Protection Protocols. It is otherwise known in our circles as the Migrant Persecution Protocols. Another way that the MPP program has been known more colloquially is as the Remain in Mexico program. That has kind of taken over the bulk of the work within the last year and a half along the border in Tijuana, as well as border cities in Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. There are others such as DHS, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, Immigrant and Customs Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Protection. These are the agencies that monitor, CBP monitors the comings and goings at the border, including airports, for example. Like if you've ever traveled internationally and when you return to the US and you have passport control, those are CBP officers who patrol the border and make sure that people have the right documentation to be entering the country. ICE is the enforcement agency that takes jurisdiction once people are inside the territory of the United States to enforce immigrants, to catch them. It's the police, the police, if you will. So they function as a police force kind of to apprehend and detain illegal immigrants within the United States. And DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is actually the agency that ICE and CBP and some other agencies that deal with immigration are housed under. So that's kind of like at the cabinet level of making decisions about how the immigration system is going to function.
You're beginning to paint a very intricate system that is part of an ecosystem, right? With various actors, various agencies, organizations, people who are primarily affected by policies that are implemented throughout this landscape. And it covers not only the geography of the border itself, but it spans beyond that, particularly in Mexico, right? Where MPP has begun to sort of pull people in different parts of the country and essentially convert it into a detention state. Can you tell us a little bit about how that system works? Maybe paint us a diagram in terms of how all these actors begin to play a role in each other's agency?
So first I'll explain it, and then I'll share a visual aid to kind of drive home some points. It is very intricate, and I think that that's one of the complexities of working in immigration law, is just understanding all the component parts and how they work together. It's also been one of the challenges to making reforms to the immigration system. I know that there's been this talk of comprehensive immigration reform as a term that we've heard a lot about in terms of legislative reform, making legal changes, but it's basically like a system that was built in fits and starts, and so things are like stacked on top of each other, and it kind of doesn't always make sense, but it's like, instead of just destroying the building and building it from the foundation, we keep like adding different things to it. It's a difficult system. It's clunky. It's got a lot of, there are a lot of exceptions and nuances, and just, it requires you to learn a lot of different things going on in the government. This is an area of law that's known as administrative law. It's basically government law, as opposed to the kind of law that is made by precedent, by Supreme Court precedent. There have, don't get me wrong, the Supreme Court has been able to get involved, such as the recent DACA decision that came out, which was one of the only positive things that's come out in the world of immigration in the last few years. But it's complicated to allow something to get to that level. So actually, I am going to use the DACA example, and I will share this graphic as I explain a little bit about how the different branches of government work with each other. As I was mentioning before, we have the Department of Homeland Security. DHS oversees both ICE and CBP, right? These are like the enforcement branches. We also have DOJ, Department of Justice. They are involved in the immigration courts. So all of the immigration courts, anytime that somebody is before an immigration judge, that's DOJ. Department of State are all the overseas embassies. So if someone is, let's say, applying for a residency visa because they got married to an American citizen and they are living in Kenya. So they would go to the American embassy in Kenya, and the American embassy in Kenya would grant the Kenyan person married to the American person a residency visa to be able to lawfully enter the country as a resident. So these are the different adjudicators of immigration. The INA, the Immigration and Nationality Act, is the main piece of legislation that sets out all of the functioning of all the different agencies. There are a few more on here, but we kept it simple for now. The federal courts are over here. So the main point that I want to drive home is that the bulk of immigration takes place under the control of the executive branch of government. That's why it's called administrative law, because it's the administration. It's like the CEO's office. And we know who's in that position now. And it's someone, and it's an administration that has had a very strong anti-immigrant agenda. And because of the way that the system is designed, where even the immigration courts are under the executive branch rather than under the judicial branch, they have been able to make a lot of wide sweeping changes to the system, because that is where the agencies are housed. So it's lawful. It's one of the few areas of law that the executive branch or the president can have almost unfettered power to make decisions. So for those who don't quite understand government or civics, I'm going to give you a specific example just to make it a little bit more concrete. So let's talk about DACA again. The DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So it was a program that President Obama put into effect rather. And it stated that if you had arrived between a certain year and a certain year, and you were, under the age of 21, I believe, you were eligible to apply for this status, which would not give you what's called a path to citizenship, but it meant that you could never be deported and that you had an ability to work, a lawful work permit. So what this administration did was try to revoke DACA. At that point, it was appealed, the attempt to revoke the executive order was appealed to the judicial branch, and SCOTUS got involved. But it's pretty rare for that type of thing to get to SCOTUS. It's only because it was trying to kill a law or trying to change a major policy that was the case. So most immigration cases get stuck down here. You know, most people who have to go try to fight for their green card, or who try to get even what's called withholding of removal, which means that you won't ever be deported. Again, no path to citizenship, but you'll never be deported. These are different types of immigration status. And people who are not here lawfully, who've been either apprehended at the border or apprehended interior of the country, are placed into what's called removal proceedings. Removal is a synonym for deportation. And so once someone in the immigration authority or the immigration police, if you will, have caught you as being either about to enter or having entered without a lawful permit, you're placed into removal proceedings. And then you get an opportunity to see an immigration judge. And again, I'm going to refer back to this graphic. The immigration judges are here under the Department of Justice. So we've seen a lot of changes in the last few years dealing with the Department of Justice making major changes to the way that the immigration courts are going to adjudicate specifically asylum cases. So I've been talking big picture about the immigration system and different types of status, but getting more to the point of what we see at the border, what I see in Tijuana, it's 99.9% asylum seekers. So just to give you a little history on what asylum is. Asylum is a remedy of protection for one person fleeing for their lives, where another country will say, come in, we'll give you safety, we'll give you refuge, and you can claim asylum here. This will be a safe space for you. That's the general concept behind it. In effect, what we see are massive numbers of people, mostly from Central America, fleeing a lot of gang violence and a lot of just complete mayhem in their societies, who are afraid for their lives. And as a result of that, they flee north. So our current asylum system came out of World War II, after World War II. As Jews were fleeing the Holocaust and going to other places across the world, it became apparent to the international community that they needed a set of rules, a set of norms on what would be acceptable to welcome in refugees. So the Refugee Act was born of that. And most countries that I know of, I've never heard of a country that does not, incorporates this international UN law of the Refugee Act into their domestic guidelines as to who qualifies for a refugee, who qualifies for asylum. And so essentially there's 5 protected grounds: race, religion, political opinion, nationality, and membership in a particular social group. And what a protected ground means is that if one of those 5 categories was why you were persecuted in your home country, was the grounds for your persecution, then you will qualify for asylum. So if you were persecuted for your religion, let me rephrase that, then you may qualify for asylum. You know, you still have to win your case, but it has to be based on one of those 5 grounds. It can't just be, a man wanted to steal my car and he was really scary, and so I'm leaving my homeland to try to live somewhere else. Unless you can prove that his motivation for wanting to steal your car was based on your political opinion or your religion, then asylum is not the remedy for you. So you can see how it forces people to engage in some creative thinking. It's not a perfect, easy system by far, and it's been very challenging to come up with legal theories for folks that are fleeing from the MS-13 or the MS-18 or cartels in the south of Mexico. They don't fit neatly into those grounds. So, what's emerged from that in the last, however many years that it's been really hot, the conflict down there, have been some more novel legal theories that had gained widespread acceptance. What this administration has done is kind of go in and say, no, that's no longer good law. So there was a major turning point in the practice of asylum law in 2018 with this decision called Matter of AB that Jeff Sessions decided to issue. And it was basically saying, women who were victims of domestic violence and fleeing abusive relationships had been finally an accepted particular social group, which is the 5th ground for asylum. After years of attempts to try to get that be a way for people to get asylum, 2014, it happened. 2018, they killed it. They also went in and said that people fleeing private actors. So there's a big distinction in asylum law about what is a government actor or if it's just a private actor. Like the example I gave about the car thief. That would be considered a private actor, motivated by personal gains. There's no sort of social issue at stake here that we want to protect. So it's very difficult, the practice of this kind of law. It doesn't mean that people have stopped coming. On the contrary, people keep coming because their lives are in danger. So it's been a very, very, very challenging few years to be doing this kind of work, and in particular at the border. It's like, what new hell are they going to give us this week? After this 2018 decision, in, I believe it was February 2019, MPP was born. And MPP, as I mentioned earlier, is Migrant Protection Protocol. So it's this idea that people will not be allowed to really settle inside the United States until they've won their asylum case. Prior to MPP, people were allowed to come in and go to where their sponsors were inside the US. So any family or friends that was willing to receive them. And from there, go to the local immigration court and fight their case. So MPP was designed to stop that because they don't want people coming in unless their status is guaranteed. So that's created communities of migrants all along the border. And it's created a lot of crime, a lot of insecurity, a lot of desperation, and has made these border towns so much more difficult for the migrants, really, more than anyone, but just in general has added a whole other layer of complexity. Migrants are very vulnerable. In Mexico, it's pretty obvious if you're not a Mexican, and that makes them much bigger targets for crime. I hear about kidnapping almost every day from migrants who are seeking asylum and they're stuck in Mexico because they're vulnerable. Vulnerable people get picked on. It's kind of a dog-eat-dog world. And, that's been one of the really unfortunate consequences of MPP. So the way the MPP functions, the design of it is that people will get to the port of entry in Mexico or at the border, say that they want asylum, they'll be processed, and then sent back to Mexico to wait for their court date. And on the day of their court hearing, they show up to the border, they show their papers that say, I'm in immigration court process and I have a court date today. They get taken into custody, big group of people, and bussed up to San Diego to the immigration courthouse. And at the end of the day, bussed back in the CBP headquarters, transferred over to Mexico and released. So they don't actually let people get used to living in the US. So that if at the conclusion of their asylum case before the immigration judge, it's denied, then, they were never in the US to begin with. That was the design of the program. That was kind of the intent behind this MPP program. So the organization that I work with, Otro Lado, had to really shift our model as a result of that. And, a lot of the needs shifted because people were there for so much longer. Whereas before, the work that the organization was doing was to prepare people for how to best present their asylum case once they crossed into the border. Now it's ongoing case management, preparing people's asylum applications, helping them prepare for their individual hearings, helping them translate their evidence, doing all the things that usually attorneys do with clients inside the US. Because so few attorneys are willing to go south of the border to meet with clients in MPP. And those that do charge exorbitant fees. So we've really kind of become like a factory of asylum applications. I mean, my day-to-day work is reviewing asylum applications. And it's not easy. It's not easy to read these stories. None of them, I don't believe that anybody makes the decision lightly to pick up their entire life and move. And if you do it, it's because you had a good reason. And, we hear a lot of negative political rhetoric about people's motivations. And, I would want those critics to come and actually talk to some people. And, that might give them a better perspective of the humanity. Because some things, they can't be faked. Fear is a very natural and human thing. And there's just so much fear, there's so much trauma, and it's a big problem. And you're just when you're in these border communities, you're just dealing with so many people that have so many problems.
I appreciate you really diving into the complexity involved, which is pretty mind-blowing. And it's also really important to, like you said, like humanize these journeys, these realities that so many of us may not be immediately familiar with. Can you tell us a little bit about, to the extent that you're able to, can you tell us a little bit about what these refugees are essentially running from? Like, you mentioned a few examples of conditions, but what would you say in a general sense is the big push behind a lot of these waves of caravans, but also what are a few different more how would you say, unique or delicate issues that are based on the individual apart from, let's say, the large caravan movement?
So I want to make a distinction between the caravan and the motivation for people's departure. Because I think anybody choosing to flee is choosing to flee for individual reasons. The caravan was more of a means to an end. Because the way I see it was a movement for people to fight back along the migration route against the control of organized crime, essentially, coyotes, traffickers, human smugglers, human traffickers. You know, the kidnapping and everything that happens along the border. There's a lot of kidnapping happens along the routes as well. You know, people come by foot. You know, if you're a Central American migrant, you have less territory to cross, but all throughout the Americas. You know, when I first started going to Tijuana in 2018, before joining the staff, there were many African migrants, many Congolese, Guineans, Cameroonians. And what folks from those countries would do would be find a country, like for example, for Guinea, it's Ecuador. Ecuador does not require a visa for people from Guinea. So they get a plane ticket and they go. And from there they go up. They go up the entire continent. They cross the forest. There's this very big forest right where Colombia and Panama meet, and where South America becomes Central America. And I've heard so many horror stories about this forest. You know, people go through it together. You have to sleep on the floor. There's so much crime and corruption that takes place, not corruption, but crime that takes place for migrants who are attacked by other people. Hit on the head with a machete, all their possessions stolen. I've heard so many people say that all their documents were stolen in the forest because they got robbed. You know, so that's also a big challenge and a big reason why the caravans formed. Although they formed in Central America, but it's to create a sense of security in a mass, you know, to say we're doing this together. So it may have been that people decided to migrate north because they wanted to take advantage of the caravan. But I think that it's kind of a two-step thing. It was more like, I need to get out of here because they're going to come after me. Oh, look, there's a caravan forming. I'll choose to go with the caravan. Most people that I've met that came through the caravan, and there've been many caravans, plural, have done so because of other independent reasons. And I'm just remembering anecdotally someone I spoke to who described it as just walking day and night. Like they barely stop to sleep because of the adrenaline, you know, and it is very bold in a way what they did, because you're really kind of claiming back the land in a way that's not completely unlike the Black Lives Matter protests. It's kind of saying our streets, you know, our lands, government borders, government security, be damned. Like this is where we need to go, and we're doing it as a people. You know, there's just like a basic humanity that comes into effect when you're dealing with migration issues, because it really is just about satisfying your primal needs. I want a safe place to live, to raise my family, to have food, to be able to give them food and lodging. That's really what people want. They're not asking for, you know, they're not trying to be Kardashians or anything crazy like that. You know, most people are just humble, nice people who just don't want to die, you know, and who don't want to die because of a stupid reason. I mean, you know, your question, I think, was asking me about what some of the reasons are. I mean, A grand majority of the cases I hear from Honduras and Guatemala are gang related, maras. Or if I was in an immigration court, I would say an illicit transnational organization that functions as a parallel state, because that allows us to make the argument that if you are not in support of these illegal organizations, then that is an expression of your political opinion, because they function as a de facto government, as the shadow government. They control, they terrorize these societies. And it is completely subjective, emotional, arbitrary, how they'll decide who they're gonna pick on, what family they decide to extort, and they rule based on fear. So, you know, my neighbor Jorge Martinez can't pay the extortion tax this week. Well, he's going to be shot dead, because that's going to teach a lesson to the rest of the community that they better pay their extortion tax. That's how they function. And if they suspect that you're doing anything to double cross them, which includes for the most part making police reports, forget it, they'll come after you for sure. But even just, you know, they monitor people's comings and goings. It is really like a society controlled by illegal, you know, black market, if you will, but it's not a market, but, you know, like a shadow government. Like they are the de facto rulers of so many territories and cities in Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Mexico too. I've heard a lot about southern Mexico. So, you know, that is really the grand majority of the cases that I see. And I also see a lot of gender-based violence. So LGBT, trans folks, forget it. They're always victimized. Fortunately, it's a lot easier for them to get asylum for the most part, because that has been established as a particular social group, your sexual identity and your sexual orientation. And, you know, there's all these rules about how to define a particular social group. One is like to be socially recognizable and distinct. Well, for the most part, if you're trans, it's pretty clear. You know, someone can look at you and identify you. You know, it's a lot harder to identify someone who has an opinion of XYZ, right? That's more of an internal thing. So it's easier on the legal end. But, you know, that's another category case we see. And women who suffer from domestic violence and gender-based violence simply for existing, simply for deciding that they want to work or they want to get an education or anything that goes against these extremely macho social mores of these societies. So that's been another area which we've had to get creative as a legal community and try to argue feminism as a political opinion, because of this decision that I mentioned in 2018 that eliminated it as a particular social group. So anyway, it's been challenging, and it's going to be even more challenging. The latest thing that was issued was a series of proposed regulations that was a combined effort of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security, basically proposing to cut the asylum system as we know it, giving immigration judges a series of powers to pre-termit cases. That means basically deny them without even letting them be heard. Outlawing, you know, private actors, so kind of building on this 2018 matter of AB decision, eliminating or the ability of people to get work permits. Currently, if your asylum application is pending for 150 days, so 5 months, you're eligible to apply for a work permit. Most of the immigration courts are clogged up. It's going to take 2 years to hear your case. So a lot of people who are inside the country are able to get work permits. That goes back to the motivation behind creating MPP. So, you know, I read those regulations and I just felt completely gutted. Just like, oh, you know, it's just endless. And, you know, going back to kind of what I was saying earlier about how the executive branch can really use their power, you know, they're doing it with these regulations because of the way the administrative law works. It's not like passing a law. It's not like passing a statute where our elected representatives vote on it. The way that you pass a regulation is what's called notice and comment. So you give notice of the proposed regulations, which was done, I believe, I want to say June 15th, but it might have been a little bit earlier. And then you set a deadline by which the public will be able to make comments, submit written comments. And then, you know, the same people who issued the regulations will review the comments and maybe incorporate them or not. So it's not a very fair system. It's extremely tilted. And, you know, as you can imagine, organizations like ours and any immigrant advocate across the country are preparing comments, and I encourage people to do that as well. It doesn't have to be on the basis of an organization. It can be individual. It's supposed to be the democratic process. So, you know, let's give them comments, plenty and plenty and plenty of comments, so that they have to read through all of them before these regulations can get passed. So that's one of the latest. MPP court has basically been closed since April, maybe the end of March. I don't remember exactly, but during all of this COVID period, it's, you know, lengthened the amount of time that people are stuck in Mexico because they haven't been able to go to court. So their cases haven't progressed. And it's just very, very, very challenging for everybody who works with this population.
I've been reading, or I've had read in the past before, about the metering process that is applied as a deterrent or as a way of prolonging the wait for migrants at the border. Can you illustrate that a bit further?
Yes. So that actually takes place before people are placed into MPP. And I kind of dived into MPP, but yes, let me take a step back, because this was kind of one of the first ways in which the U.S. government was trying to limit the ability of asylum seekers to ask for asylum. So according to law, someone who wants to claim asylum in the United States or to request asylum in the United States can approach the border and say, I'm afraid, I want to ask for asylum. And the US will let them in and give them that opportunity. But what started happening a couple of years back is they were saying, no, we don't have the capacity to take everybody in at once that wants to ask for asylum. Capacity issues. So you're going to have to wait. We're only going to take a certain number of people a day. So that's the metering process. It's this idea of you put your name on a list, and when your number is called, you can go ask for asylum at the port of entry. So it's become a very complicated collaboration between the US government and the Mexican government. Essentially what happens, and I actually have I have some images. So this is a scene at Chaparral Plaza, which is basically when you are crossing from Mexico into the United States. This is the plaza on the Mexican side. And this is an E. There's a big sign that says Mexico. So this is a Mexican person who works for Grupos Beta. So Grupos Beta is the humanitarian arm of the Mexican Institute for Migration, the Mexican government agency that handles immigration. So Grupos Beta monitors the list, and they keep this book. It's a physical book. We're talking low tech. And what happens is individuals will decide to sign up for a number, and then once they register, their names get written next to the number in this little book. Then they get a little piece of paper with their number. This is the process. And it usually takes anywhere from 4 to 8 months to wait for your number to be called. So even before February 2019, when MPP was put into effect, there were already lots of migrant communities piling up along the border because of this metering policy, because they were waiting for their numbers to be called. But previously, prior to MPP, they would not be sent back to Mexico once their numbers were finally called. Whereas now, the grand majority of folks will have their number called, they'll go present themselves for asylum, get processed, and then sent right back to await their court hearing. I do want to specify, though, that MPP is only for Spanish-speaking countries and non-Mexicans. So Mexicans are not subject to MPP because that would be completely contrary to asylum law, that you would be forced to wait in the country that you're fleeing from. So there is a little bit of logic in the way that things are being processed. But essentially, anyone from Central America, Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, any other countries in Central and South America, you'll be put into MPP. So these are 3 minors. This is a long walking bridge once you're in the Chaparral Plaza that takes you to where the entry point is to enter CBP. And minors, unaccompanied minors, people who are under the age of 18, do not have to pass through, are not metered, and are not placed into MPP. So that's one positive thing, that they'll be able to go right up to the front and say, I'm an unaccompanied minor, and CBP is required to take them into custody. Now, as you can imagine, there are violations of this, which is why people such as myself, prior to being a staff attorney, volunteer, lawyer, will accompany them just to make sure that CBP is doing their job, because it's a lot harder to turn away kids if someone's watching that knows what's supposed to go down. So these were 3 boys, and they are now in the US. Okay, let's see. So this is a picture of, I'm kind of just showing general border scenes here, kind of getting away from the metering policy for a minute. But this is to show, this is the wall, the border wall in Tijuana. And every Sunday, there is a binational church service that accompanies this kind of grace period that they allow. On the other side of the wall, on this side, this is the Mexican side, so people can go right up at any time of day and touch it. On the American side, there's a big buffer between the wall and where people can go. However, on Sundays, they'll open it up and let folks come right up to the front and visit with family. So you'll see a lot of deportees, for example, whose family is still inside the US, will visit with each other across the wall on Sundays.
Is that Friendship Park?
Yes, this is Friendship Park. You know, it's kind of like a general amnesty. And you might be asking, well, if the family member is going all the way down to the wall, why don't they just go into Mexico to visit their family? The answer is they may be undocumented.
And do you happen to know if there are any protections in place for those who are coming to that buffer zone on the US side?
It's kind of an unspoken amnesty. I don't know of anybody getting arrested by ICE for doing that.
It's kind of remarkable that a space like that exists in this current state of things, right? I mean, I believe
For sure.
It was Nixon administration on behalf of the First Lady who kind of like spearheaded the opening of this park. And the fact that it's lasted this long and has maintained a certain level of integrity, even though the space has become so much highly militarized and
Oh, yeah.
opening between the walls. I believe before it used to be like the earliest iteration of the wall, which was like barbed wire fencing, and then it evolved into the corrugated metal, and then now it's these sort of like steel mesh that spans not even like half an inch of opening, but sort of become much more and more opaque, whereas before you could actually hug each other across the wall. But it's still maintained that possibility for people to connect, even though it definitely highlights these parallels with prison visitation.
I'm sure that people are pretty cautious. I don't think that they're going to be risking going to talk to their family members if they're not able to have lawful status, because there are so many people, there are so many officers on the other side. So it would be an interesting question. What is the formal policy, if anything? I can tell you that one day that I was there, the CBP officer who had been monitoring the binational church service for, I guess, a year or something, was his last day. And it was quite moving to see. There was an American pastor on one side and a Mexican pastor on the other, and they both like included the CBP officer and his family in the prayers and the blessings, and like, thank you for giving us this space. And, it was very humanizing, to use the same term again. And you don't see a lot of that in the kind of work that I do. It's very conflict. More pictures of the wall. This is one of the shelters, Iglesia Embajadores de Jesús. And they have two parts. They have like a Haitian shelter, and they have a, shelter for non-Haitians. Pictures. And then this is one area that had beds, but it's no privacy. As you can see, everybody's just one on top of each other. And
there's so many events that have transpired in the last 6 months specific to COVID-19, and also this gaining momentum in the anti-racist movement. I'm wondering if you're able to touch on the intersectionality of race and migration that's at play in people's lives along the border. You talked about African diaspora sort of having their own set of conflicts in engaging with the borderlands. And of course, in Tijuana, we have the Haitian community who have been there growing steadily in numbers since the most recent earthquake and devastation of their homeland. Can you tell us a little bit about what those experiences might look like?
Yeah, there are Haitians who've just decided to ask for asylum in Mexico and just create their community right there. There's some great Haitian food. As for the Africans, what I can tell you is that we've seen far fewer in the last, 6 to 12 months, mostly as a result of Mexican immigration apprehending Black migrants in the south of Mexico, in Chiapas. There's a town called Tapachula, which is basically the first town after you cross the Guatemalan border into Mexico. And if you were to go to the Mexican immigration detention centers there, you would find many African migrants, and they're just getting stuck there. And, it's a racist world especially when you're dealing with desperation, poverty, any sort of dynamics of power. And so because of the racism that exists, even within the enforcement of immigration laws, we have not seen at the border a lot of Black migrants lately. And, as I mentioned before, in order for MPP to exist, there had to have been some agreement between the Mexican and the American governments. And I'm certain that there's something going on as well, because they're basically enforcing U.S. immigration. By ramping up the enforcement in the south of Mexico, they've prohibited caravans from crossing, and they've really been detaining a ton of Black migrants. So it's bad. It's really bad, and we do, just because of the numbers of people that we see and because of Spanish language, like the services that we offer are more geared towards Latin than Blacks. But I know that, like many other organizations right now, we're trying to really examine that and see how we can center the experiences of Black migrants in the work that we do.
And that's a really interesting point, because language is such a crucial tool to be able to navigate this very complex process, right? I've read about several indigenous folks who also find themselves at battle with the system because there's often not enough representation of their language to be able to serve as translators to effectively advocate for them, right? So I would assume that's another huge component of the community of translators who are required in order to be able to help process these claims. And beyond that, just to be able to access resources in general.
It's, they're definitely one of our more vulnerable communities that we try to track when they come through our clinics. And it is really hard. A lot of people from Guatemala still speak native Maya languages. And as I've learned, there are many variations. I had a client who spoke Mam, and we got her a Mam interpreter, but it was a different form of Mam, and they couldn't really understand each other, and it's a huge challenge, huge.
Can you tell us a little bit about the types of feelings and emotions that come up from working so closely with migrants in these cases? I can only assume that your perspective continuously sort of like shifts in terms of it sort of broadens your perspective, right? But can you tell us a little bit about what your journey has been in terms of witnessing this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard work. It's hard work. I feel like it's been a little bit easier to handle during COVID because I haven't had that daily contact with people like I usually have. We've had more of a remote model. And so my role has been more like supervising the work that our volunteers, we still have tons of volunteers working with us who are working by phone, by WhatsApp and whatnot to get information from clients and write their asylum application. So I've been kind of in the background, like reviewing the materials, and it's been a little bit of a breather for me because it is really intense. And I've suffered a lot of what's called secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, which is just when you hear these stories over and over and over again. And, I think anybody, a medical provider, legal provider, anyone who works with this community is going to feel some amount of secondary trauma, because you cannot hear these horrific stories and not be affected in some way. And I think it's a big load to carry. If I had one ask for going forward, it would be for any licensed attorney, whatever their practice is, just to take one immigration asylum case, just to take one asylum case, because we can't carry it all ourselves. It's too heavy. It's a lot of people in a lot of pain, and the amount of work that goes into proving somebody's case, it's challenging because on the one hand, it's your rapport with the individual. So you have to develop trust. And as attorneys, we were not trained like psychologists or therapists or people who work with heavy emotional issues. Like, I have no training for how to put up boundaries and kind of protect myself. And that's something I've really had to teach myself to do, because I think those of us who go into this kind of work, we have big hearts and we're empaths and we want to help and we want to heal and we want to hold people's pain. But ultimately, it's their journey. I can help them. I can use my knowledge, my language ability, my professional training and help them. But I can't carry them. I can't take their suffering away from them. It's at the end of the day, it's their story, it's their life. So that's an area that becomes really challenging to navigate when you're working in this space. And I certainly am not saying I have it all figured out. It's constant adjustment.
Can you tell us, just taking it back a little bit in terms of what your journey has been through this process, what got you involved in this type of work?
Well, I was raised speaking French and Spanish, and in college I learned to speak Portuguese. So I love speaking different languages, and I love talking to people from different parts of the world. My own family history is basically built on immigration. Each of my 4 grandparents was born in a different country. And if it wasn't for this idea, which has now maybe shown itself to be more of a myth than reality, but this idea that the U.S. is this melting pot for multiple different people to come together, then I wouldn't exist. I basically am a product of immigration from different parts of the world. My grandfather's family came from Ukraine. On my mom's side, my mom's mother came from North Africa, Algeria. My father's father came from Spain. My father's mother came from Argentina. So, somehow that produced 2 people who met, and then, here I am. So it's just something that is very natural to me, and felt like a good fit. I had flirted with other types of law, and after the election in 2016, I kind of got re-energized to get back into more something that felt like was needed. I had been doing corporate law, trying something that might be a little bit more financially beneficial. It was not for me, and I kind of dived head back into this kind of work, and was working here in South Florida. Well, I'm here in South Florida now due to the quarantine, but yeah, working with people in the Miami area, and then went out to Tijuana a few times as a volunteer and really fell in love with the work on the border, and was hired full-time with Otro Lado, and sort of relocated. So that's been my journey.
Great. And why do you feel this work is important?
To me, it's all about connecting with the clients. You know, I love learning about different people's background and the way they see the world, and just little things about people that I would never know. You know, I would never cross paths with many of my clients unless I was their attorney. And I think my life has been enriched by those connections and by the ability to feel like I understand different perspectives. You know, it's made me a more rich and interesting person. And that's for me on a personal level. I mean, this work is important because it's under attack, you know, and you need people to help defend it. If there were no immigrant defenders or people who were supporting migrants or asylum seekers, it would be so much harder than it already is for them. It's very, you know, it's I keep talking about humanity. It's a basic human right. You know, it's basic. People just need to be able to live their life without fear. That's it. And you know, and throughout the history of the world and civilization, we've had migrations. The concept of borders is an administrative efficiency, but it's, you know, it's kind of antithetical to the lived human experience. Like, I don't think that it makes sense logically. You know, it's something that was done on the map. And I think that doing this kind of work allows us to reconnect with those more natural things, such as migration. Yeah.
Why do you feel that people in a general sense should care about this work? Why? What a part of it do you think they should hold on to when considering these narratives, and what is it that they should hold on to and take back with them from this talk?
I just think that for many of us who live in the US and who were, you know, grew up in the US, we have a lot. And I'm not saying we need to give up everything to help other people, but it would take this much to help someone this much. You know, it's like, it doesn't require a lot to have such a big impact on somebody else. And that's what I want people to take away. It's kind of like just listening to someone, you know, trying to listen to their story. It unburdens them from whatever they're experiencing. You know, I think there's so many things that people could do depending on their capacity to help asylum seekers, let's say, you know, and that could be anything ranging from sponsoring someone if you're a US citizen or a resident, saying, yes, I'll welcome them into my home. Could be going to visit someone in a detention center, an immigration detention center, just having a conversation, just making them feel like a normal person. You know, it could be, well, now we have this remote system, you know, spending some time on the phone, especially if you speak Spanish, trying to help do these asylum applications. Giving money to support these organizations. I mean, I guess the one thing I want people to take away from this is knowing, at least from someone who's been doing this kind of work, that any of these claims of fraud or trying to like get into the US for, you know, evil motives. It's not true. You know, these are people that are just wanting to live a life of safety and security. That's it. And I think it's our duty as humans to look out for each other. You know, it can't just be, I'm safe over here in my world. Too bad for you that your country has all these problems. You know, I mean, not to get too political, but in a way, the US has played a role in a lot of the conflicts that have caused these countries to be so unstable. So it's completely false to say it's your problem, not my problem. Well, guess what? It is our problem. Like, we were part of the problem. So we can't just turn our backs on people that are fleeing from the result of what our government did. You know, most of immigration issues are caused by US foreign policy in Western Hemisphere. Like, that's the truth. And all the interventions that have happened in, depending on our interests, picking and choosing, have left countries with messed up situations. And so we have a safe country in comparison, and we have a lot of space. There is no capacity issue. So to me, it does not make sense to be so exclusive and try to preserve all the good stuff just for us. But that's who I am. You know, I can't watch someone suffer and not feel like I want to help somehow. And so I think if others are moved in the same way, then they should try to find a way to help in this situation, because it is something where small action goes such a long way.
Maya, thank you so much for today's talk. You've really expanded on so many different topics and a really complex web of factors. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we leave today?
No, I think I've pretty much covered it. But thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and try to spread the good word.
Yo me despierto y me levanto pensando que era un sueño cuando veo por los medios la caravana de hondureños.
Estamos en CASA HOGAR El Puente. Mi nombre es Michael Rodríguez, coordinador general del albergue, también uno de los fundadores junto a Douglas Oviedo. En este momento vamos a pasar a enseñarle lo que es el albergue por dentro. El albergue está diseñado para madres y niños solicitantes de asilo. Son los que más necesitan en este momento. Esta es la habitación principal del albergue. Cada litera está capacitada para 5 personas. Vamos a pasar en lo que es enseñarles lo que es el baño que está dentro del albergue. Y uno de los cuartos. Este cuarto está capacitado para 5 personas. Cada cama es personal. Este es el área del comedor. Como pueden ver, es al aire libre, disfrutando de lo que es la frescura de Tijuana. Esto que está aquí es un proyecto de baños. Como acaban de ver ahorita, en la casa solo hay un baño y el albergue está capacitado para 25 personas, entonces no es suficiente. Con la recaudación se trata de poder terminar estos baños. Estos baños están valorados en 56,000 pesos. Entonces la idea es poderlo terminar para darle un mejor servicio y una mejor comodidad a las personas. Esta es la área de la cocina. El gasto mensual del albergue son de 38,000 pesos. Estamos cubriendo agua, luz, transporte a la garita, energía, el gas y todo lo básico que se necesita. En esta área de aquí donde está este piso es para poder hacer una bodega. También con la recaudación queremos poder terminarla. La bodega queremos guardar alimento y cosas de higiene, porque pues como acaban de ver ahorita les enfocamos el baño y lo tenemos ahí afuera, no lo tenemos guardado. También les queremos mostrar lo que es el huerto. Tenemos un proyecto de huerto, poder sembrar y poder sacar lo que se necesita, y lo que no podamos consumir poderlo donar a otro albergue. Pues tenemos también una maravillosa vista a Tijuana. Les queremos dar muchas gracias a todas las personas porque están donando, que nos están dando ese granito de arroz y que nos están ayudando a que nosotros podamos ayudar. En el nombre del puente les queremos dar muchas gracias por su apoyo.
Lograr, no hay imposible. Juntos somos más, juntos somos fuertes. Juntos lo podemos lograr, no hay imposible.